Welcome you to our YouTube channel. We will be starting today with the book of Micah. We'll be reading through the prophet Micah's words and trying to see a little bit of historical context and maybe even some wisdom for today for us. And so let's go ahead and look into our Bible and to the minor prophet Micah. This will be the first in a series of studies, and we're just going to slowly go through each chapter. So, the book of Micah, chapter 1, beginning with verse 1 and 2, it says, "The word of the Lord that came to Micah the Morashite in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. Hear, all ye people, hearken, O earth, and all that therein is, and let the Lord God be witness against you, for the Lord from his holy temple." And so, here we have Micah, one of the minor prophets of the Lord. He was called in to prophesy while all 12 tribes still were in Israel, in the land of the Canaanites. And so the Assyrians had not yet come in. They had not taken or destroyed the 10 northern tribes yet. Micah's prophecy begins right around 742, roughly speaking. And he's giving approximately a 10-year warning to the people. If they pay attention and listen to what he's about to say, they may actually be able to avoid destruction. And so we can see in our timeline up in the top left corner, the blue line with the numbers on it, 742, Micah begins his ministry. Right around 740, Isaiah begins his prophetic ministry. Right around 733, Tilgath-Pileser III of the Assyrians invades Israel. And so on the right-hand side, we can see a map of this area where the tribes are, where Judah is, where Simon is, where each one of them have the lands of their inheritance. And we can see where the Dead Sea, the Salt Sea is, and in the exploded area there in the upper middle, we see where each one of the prophets basically came from. Micah, where he came from; Amos, where he came from; Isaiah, Hosea, right off of the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea. So this warning came in about 10 years before the Assyrians would be coming in and destroying them. God's going to lay out in this prophecy all the things he sees wrong with his people. If they listen and pay attention, they can avert the danger. If they do not listen, if they do not pay attention, then of course the danger is going to come and they will be destroyed. So what we're going to be covering in the course of the book of Micah, the witness that God brings against his people. Basically, there's 5 points that God brings out, and we'll be seeing these as we go through it. In different spots, he speaks about the same thing and repeats them. But the basic 5 things that God's speaking of to his people: number 1, idolatry; number 2, covetousness; number 3, leaders that hate good and love evil; number 4, the lust for money; and number 5, religious hypocrisy. These are the points that God's going to bring out throughout the prophecy of Micah and try to show his people, look, these things in and of themselves are what are bringing about your destruction. They of themselves weaken you as a people. And so when destruction comes, it's not really, it's the destruction of God, because God is the one who has established the rules that work in this world. But the reality is the destruction is brought upon the people by their own choices, because these things destroy you. And so when these things are in our life on a personal level, they also destroy us, whether it's idolatry, covetousness, etc. And so these are the things we want to pay special attention to in our own personal lives, first and foremost, in our family life, in our church life, and then we build out into our community and into where we live. We want to be very careful for these things, because these are the things, these are one of the some of the 5 principal things that bring about the destruction of a people. So let's go on. Who is prophet Micah? God gives us 2 prophets who give us a very great hope. The prophet Jonah and the prophet Micah. They are great hopes because in both cases it was just one man willing to do God's will that changed the nation. Not that Jonah was really willing, but he did finally go, having his arm kind of twist behind his back, so to speak. But he did go, and it was just one man that changed the nation. And I speak of what Micah did, not in changing the 10 northern tribes, but what he did changed Judah, the southern 2 tribes. Because of Micah, Judah repented somewhat, and its destruction was actually delayed for 100 years. From when the Assyrians came in under Tilgath-Pileser III, it was approximately 100 years before Nebuchadnezzar would come in and destroy the southern kingdoms. So, and part of that was the prophecies of Micah the prophet. So they were valuable. They saved some people's lives, because otherwise all 12 tribes would have been hammered by the Assyrians, and lots of innocent people would have died. Not that lots didn't die, but there would have been many more that died if it had been all 12 tribes. And so there was value in what Micah did, in that it saved some people their lives. And so Tilgath-Pileser marched on the Levant for the 5th time around the year 734, reaching as far as the southern border of Egypt. This campaign resulted in the conquest of Gaza and the submission of numerous states, effectively bringing the entire Levant under direct or indirect Assyrian rule. Assyria and Egypt also shared a border for the first time in history. Ashkelon, Judah, Edom, Moab, and Ammon, and the Muna Arab tribe all began paying tribute to Tilgath-Pileser. By extending his control throughout the Levant, Tilgath-Pileser formed a semicircle of control around Israel and armed Damascus and cut them off from Egypt, which had at the time offered support to the Levantian states. The Syrian effort resulted in Aram Damascus becoming both geopolitically isolated and without a large enough food supply to feed its people. Tilgath-Pileser resolved to cement his conquest. In this year, he again campaigned against Aram Damascus, still the strongest remaining native state in the region, which was supported by the Assyrian tributaries Tyre and Ashkelon, as well as Israel. In 732, Damascus fell, and Tilgath-Pileser annexed the lands of Aram Damascus in the same conflict. Tilgath-Pileser also captured Tyre and defeated Israel, which he divided in half, annexing the northern portion of the kingdom as the province of Megiddo and subjugating the southern portion as a vassal kingdom. And so what happened when Tilgath-Pileser did come in 10 years after the prophecies of Micah, he took out the 10 northern tribes and those that were around them, effectively surrounding Judah, Jerusalem, and the southern tribes. However, even though they were surrounded, they were preserved. They began to pay money, tax, to the Assyrians, and they were preserved. Like I said, they were under captivity. They were under a type of financial slavery, but they didn't lose their lives, and so that was very important. So, continuing in the book of Micah, chapter 1, we'll go on in verse 3 through 5. For behold, the Lord cometh forth of his place, and will come down and tread upon the high places of the earth, and the mountains shall be molten under him, and the valleys shall be cleft as wax before the fire, and as the waters that are poured down a steep place. For the transgressions of Jacob, all this, and for the sins of the house of Israel. What is the transgression of Jacob? Is it not Samaria? And what are the high places of Judah? Are they not Jerusalem? So God comes in and he begins in his prophecy, bringing in the picture of a God coming down from heaven and punishing his people. He talks about treading on the high places. And we'll get into a little bit more of what this means a little bit farther in the study. But the idea is there is wrath being poured out, and the wrath is being poured out because the people have abandoned their God. They have abandoned truth. It began in Samaria, but it also is in Jerusalem. So the capitals of both places are being brought to the surface. God's saying, I'm coming in. What are your transgressions? I'm going to tell you what your transgressions are. Pay attention. In 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 29 through 34, we have some of the things that God is talking about in the time of Micah. So let's have a look at what this says. Again, what it said there in verse 5 was, is not Samaria part of the problem? Is not Jerusalem part of the problem? So let's see what was happening in this period of time. And so 1 Kings 16 is actually this period of time. Micah's coming in, and he's prophesying about what happened here. So, verse 29 through 34. And in the 38th year of Asa, king over Judah, began Ahab the son of Omri to reign over Israel. And Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. And Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him. And it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he took to wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. And he reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. And Ahab made a grove, and Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him. In his day did Heel the Bethelite build Jericho, and laid the foundation thereof in Abiram, his firstborn, and set up the gates thereof in his youngest son Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake by Joshua the son of Nun. So what we have as we're reading through here, we have a king coming in, Ahab, and I'm sure most of us have heard about Ahab and Jezebel. They come in, and as it says here, they did more to provoke God than any others. They came in, of course, we know from the Old Testament that they were slaughtering the prophets of God, the ministry of God. They came against God. God brought in through Elijah and Elisha a time of drought to punish the people. If we remember the story of the mountain, when they went up to the mountain and the prophet of God called all the priests of Baal up, set up 2 altars and said, look, you guys do a sacrifice to your God first, and I'll do a sacrifice to the real God. And so the prophets of Baal set up their altar, sacrificed their cow, and proceeded to dance and jump and call out to their God. God's prophet mocked them, told them, maybe you need to yell louder. Maybe your God's sleeping. Maybe he's on vacation, or who knows what. But in the end, their gods never answered them. And so God's prophet did his sacrifice, bowed down, prayed to God. Fire came out of heaven, devouring his sacrifice, devouring the water he had dumped over the firewood and the sacrifice, and showing the people that God is the only God. There is no other God. This is what we're talking about. This is the time period when the people, even though the prophet of God came in and destroyed many of the Baal's prophets, we know from that story Jezebel came out and hunted God's people. So Micah's coming out, and he's referring, you guys have seen the power of God. You've seen fire come out of heaven, devour the sacrifices, and yet you still want to sacrifice to Baal. This is the problem. Ahab, Jezebel, did more to anger God than all were before them. This is actually why Tilgath-Pileser and the Assyrian armies are on the march. God has roused their heart to come and punish God's people. So they're coming, and what we're seeing in Micah is what's essentially going to happen. It's not literally God himself coming down and wreaking retribution on the people. It's actually their own actions, their own decisions that have called to the evil in the hearts of their neighbors to come in and devour them. And so this is what's happening. When we look at us as humans, oftentimes we try to imitate, and this can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. There are ample locations throughout the scriptures that have a man of God traveling to the tops of the mountains to speak with God. and is often the case when we see something that appears to work for someone else, we may attempt to imitate it. God's people began during this time of Ahab, during the time of Micah. God's people began to do things their own way. They did not want to follow the rules. They made altars in high places, and when God wouldn't answer, they added the gods of other people around them. They didn't want to go to God's servant because God's servants were telling them their sins. So when they went to Isaiah, when they went to Micah, when they went to any of the rest of God's servants would call out their sins. The people didn't want to hear their sins being called out. No one wants to backtrack on the plush, pleasurable life that they think that they have. So they would set up their own altars, they would put their own gods in, and they tried to build them up on high because this is where they felt they were getting closer to God. They would do it their own way. And also, as often the case in the Old Testament, people would make their idols out of precious metals. And so as you had a people that were wealthy and more capable, they not only had gods of wood and stone, but soon they had gods of silver and gold. And they would set these up, these precious metals, and these were their gods, because as you came to something more valuable, more pure, the gods would surely have to listen to you. Well, when the Assyrians came in under Tilgath-Pileser III, and then after him Sennacherib came in, they would take away all that precious material, thus fulfilling God's word. And the mountains shall be molten under him, and the valleys shall be cleft as wax before the fire. So their enemies came in understanding that in all these places there's riches, there's wealth to be obtained. The people of God have deteriorated morally and beyond that, actual physically, because as we begin to separate ourselves from God, we become a weak people. We become a weak people because we no longer serve God. Our morals degrade, our ability to love our neighbors, our self degrades, all these things degrade, and we become a people ripe for the plucking for our enemies. And so in came the enemies of Israel and began to plunder all of their riches. So let's go on, verse 6 and 7. Therefore I will make Samaria as an heap of field, and as plantings of a vineyard, and I will pour down the stones thereof into the valley, and I will discover the foundations thereof, and all the graven images thereof shall be beaten to pieces, and all the hires thereof shall be burned with the fire, and all the idols thereof I will lay desolate, for she hath gathered it of the hire of an harlot, and they shall return to the hire of a harlot. So the map in the center middle there, the pink in there, this is where Assyria is coming during this period of time. They're coming in, they will be conquering all the way down just about to Jerusalem. Just after this, they actually go down a little bit farther. The green area is the furthest extent of what they actually end up conquering. Although the Jerusalem area and roundabout, they do not technically actually conquer with military, but they do put them in a subservient position. And so Jerusalem and Hezekiah, who is going to be king in that period of time, ends up paying tributes to Assyria. Interestingly enough, we've got some pictures here. These pictures are roughly what the god Moloch looked like. This is the god that Israel began to copy. It came out of other cultures, other nations. It's a god that looks like a cow. You can see up in the upper top left, it's kind of a golden looking, very beautiful. Typically speaking, when they built this, the hands would be in an outstretched form, not always, but there were always these places where you could place your sacrifice. And so as we look in the bottom center, you can see two pencil drawings, one on the right with the cow with his hands out, the other one with his hands up, but in his chest there's these cavities where you can place your whatever it is your sacrifice is in these cavities. And so typically speaking, what people did when they began to build these particular sacrifices was the time when Israel also was doing a lot of child sacrifice. And we can equate that very well to today's world with abortion. The purpose of these sacrifices wasn't to please a god. The purpose of these sacrifices was to relieve yourself of a burden that you didn't want. maybe an unintended consequence of something that you probably shouldn't have been doing. And so these unintended, these undesirables, they would take and they would sacrifice them. This was their way of disposing of them. Today we abort them, and their body parts are used for scientific study. This is what was happening. This is part of the absolute hatred that God has for what his people are doing. They brought in these beliefs from outside, and they began to practice them themselves. Interestingly enough, the image on the bottom left, the cow that's in color with all the bright colors, is actually a recent remake of the god Moloch, and was actually seen in one of the big carnival parties that was had in Central America. And so I'll just leave that there. This is something that the people, again, interestingly enough, are picking up. It's an old thing, and when God's people begin to slide, it's interesting how many of those ancient things we begin to readapt to and put into our society. Killing our kids, sacrificing them for pleasure, for whatever, worshiping false gods, idolatry. And you think about the money it took to make any of these statues. You have a people that are not poor, but they're willing to sacrifice that money for their pleasures. These are the important things. These are the things God's bringing out. These are the things that he's so angry about, because these are the people who are known as God's people. In perspective, it would be the church in today's day. They're acting worse in many ways than the people of the world. Let's continue. Verses 8 and 9. God says, "Therefore I will wail and howl. I will go stripped and naked. I will make a wailing like the dragons, and the mourning as the owls. For her wounds are incurable. For it is come unto Judah, he is come unto the gate of my people, even Jerusalem." So this is a very accurate prophecy. And like I said, it was 10 years before the actual event. Quite astounding how close he comes. The Assyrians, like I said in the map, in the pink, this is the first time that they come in with Tilgath-Pileser. He comes all the way up to the border, the boundary of Jerusalem. That's where he stops, and he goes back. Later on, like I said, Sennacherib comes in and conquers farther south. Literally, when he conquers there in right up to the border of Jerusalem, he marches off the people. And this is an important piece of information, because we're going to have farther on in this chapter, or not in this chapter, but in the book of Micah, where it talks about Rachel crying for her children, a passage that is then partially fulfilled in the New Testament when it talks about Jesus' birth, and Herod sends out his soldiers to kill all the children, 2 and under. Remember that? So Rachel's crying for her children. Literally, the Syrians don't conquer Jerusalem, nor do they get to Bethlehem. Don't forget that. So the red line is on the border. They come all the way into Benjamin's territory and Ephraim's territory. And in here, we will find the area where the people of God are marched, just like it says in verse 8, stripped naked. And they will be marched stripped naked in front of Rachel's tomb. That's an interesting thing. And so they're marched off, they're taken captive, those that aren't killed, and eventually spread throughout the world, the kingdom of Assyrians, and they're taken. You can see in the red there, those lines, the pink area on the map, the lines, the yellow line, the red lines, the purple lines. These are where they inevitably took many of the people that they took as slaves or captives. Interestingly, if you follow these lines all the way to Nineveh, to the extreme, just a little bit to the east of Nineveh and north, there's a body of water. This body of water is interesting because you're getting into the land in that time of the Midianites. And it's not too far from there where you find a genetic pocket of people that the Central American southern area come from in the male gene line. which is cute, interestingly enough. From there, you also get the R1A and R1B that go up into Europe, which is also very interesting to think about, and a small pocket also from there, P, which ends up going down into the Philippines. And so that's just an interesting thing to think about as the Assyrians are taking them off and sending them out and scattering them, God's people. You can see in the bottom two pictures here, these are murals and rocks. These are carved. This is about the war with Tilgath-Pileser and the 10 northern tribes. They were marched off. These are the pictures of them being marched off with the Assyrian troops. They were marched off before all of their enemies, embarrassed before the world, God's people. God did not save them. God did not come in and rescue them. They were marched off, and it was humiliating. And this was kind of the point of it. When we persist in our sins and doing that which is evil before God, there is a payment day. That payment day may seem to never come. Sometimes it's easy to look at our life and say, we can do sin as long as we want. There's never a price to pay. There is a price to pay. And that day does come. And it did come for God's people. And the southern tribes, it also came for them when eventually Nebuchadnezzar came in and destroyed the southern tribes. So let's go on. Starting in verse 10, what we have here is paranomasia. A paranomasia essentially is, you might say, a play on words. It's a form of poetry that pokes fun at someone. It's basically God poking fun at his people, because in God's people, names have meaning, and so they would name towns based on what was important in that town. And so God comes in through his prophet and actually gives them this poem that is to mock them. They think they're so good. They think they're so strong. Well, you know, from their strength comes their weakness. So on the left-hand side, we have as it's written in the King James. On the right-hand side, we have probably a closer translation to what it actually says in the Hebrew, because like I said, this is really a play on words. So I'll read the first on the left, verses 10 and 11. Declare ye it not at Gath, weep ye not at all. In the house of Ophrah, roll thyself in the dust. Pass ye away, thou inhabitants of Saphir, having thy shame naked. The inhabitant of Zanan came not forth in the morning of Beth Ezel, and shall receive of you his standing. So this is what it says, which seems kind of complicated. I mean, in a sense, we can still understand it. But as we go through these, each one of these place names has a double entende. It's a double meaning. And so this was actually quite common, where you would take a name, and this name would not just mean the name, but it had its own interpretation. And this is where the pun comes in here. So on the other side, we have the more literal translation. So on the left it was, declare ye not at Gath, weep ye not at all. So what does it say? It says, do not gossip about this in Telltown. Don't waste your tears. In Dustville, roll in the dust. So what you have here is this whole idea that the very town itself has to do with what God's saying. Don't gossip about this in Telltown. Declare ye it not at Gath. Don't waste your tears. In the next one, in the house of Ophrah, roll thyself in the dust. And Ophrah is Dustville. So, in Dustville, roll in the dust. This is the play on words. Let's go on with verse 11. Ye will pass by naked and with shame, city of beauty. So Saphir was, the name Saphir is to mean city of beauty or beautiful people. These are people that, you know, they stand out. This is the way they view themselves. And so God's saying, you're going to be passing by naked and shameful. It's the exact opposite of the way they looked at themselves. Next, the citizens of Exetburg will never get out alive. And so they were renowned in the city of Zanan for being able to get out of town, go out into the fields, do their work, visit nearby. But when this moment comes, it's not going to happen. So the citizens of Exitburg, which is basically what Zanan translates to, they will not get out. Not this time. And then the last part, lament, last stand city. There's nothing in you left standing. So Beth Ezel basically translates to the last stand city, and they're not going to be the last stand city. There's nothing going to be left standing in them. So this is the pun that God's giving them in prophecy, which is very interesting. Let's continue, verses 12 and 13. I'll read the left side, the King James. For the inhabitant of Maroth waited carefully for good, but evil came down from the Lord unto the gate of her of Jerusalem. O thou inhabitant of Lachish, bind the chariot to the swift beast. She is the beginning of the sin of the daughter of Zion, for the transgression of Israel were found in thee. So again, we have God using this double entende, talking about these cities and paralleling them with what's going to happen. So now let's read the other side. The villagers of bitter town wait in vain for sweet peace. Harsh judgment has come from God and entered the city of peace. All you who live in Chariotville, get into your chariots for flight. You led the daughters of Zion into trusting not God, but chariots. Similar sins in Israel also got their start in you. So he's going through and he's naming all these places and saying, what you guys are renowned for, this is coming against you. And this really relates back to what we have in the New Testament where God says, that which you plant, you will sow. And so many of these places were renowned for something, and now this is coming against them. And this is part of God's punishment. Verse 14 and 15. Go ahead and give. Let's read the left-hand side, the King James first. It says, Therefore shalt thou give presents to Moresheth Gath. The houses of Achzib shall be a lie to the king of Israel. Yet will I bring an heir unto thee, O inhabitants of Mareshah. He shall come unto Adullam, the glory of Israel. Make thee bald and poll thee for thy delicate children. Enlarge thy baldness as the eagle, for they are gone into captivity from thee. And so again, God's coming in and laying out what he's going to do. Let's read the other side now, 14 and 15. Go ahead and give your goodbye gifts at Goodbyeville. Mirage Town beckoned but disappointed Israel's king. Inheritance City has lost its inheritance. Glory Town has seen the last of its glory. So these are important things because this is all that was going to be happening during this time. And so we can see the red lines from Marish and Adullam going down to the map in the lower right-hand side. And this is where those cities are located. And it's interesting to look at these. You can see that these cities are actually a little bit south of Jerusalem, which is important because really what we have is coming right down to Jerusalem, right about Gibeah or Jericho, right about in that line. There's an impassable, very difficult mountain range that's hard to get through. You can't really get through it coming down from the north. And so to come down from the north, they would have to go through a pathway that came in from the east through Jericho and then south to Jerusalem. Or you came in from the lower, you came down the coast and then came up towards Jerusalem from the southwest to get to Jerusalem, and then up into, again, the pathway that would lead to Jericho, which also turned off and went to Bethel. And so you had these different paths that were in here. So there was a reason why the Assyrians did what they did. They came down the coastal way and came in this lower pass because this lower pass was so much easier to come in. And of course we know, according to the story in the Old Testament, when the Assyrians came up to this point, took these cities that we're talking about in verse 15, which are close to this highway that leads into Jerusalem, then they heard some rumors and they abandoned their conquest and left. And this was the moment when Jerusalem was saved. They were saved on two different rights. Number one being God saved them because of their own repentance and searching for Him. But aside from that, we also know through the story of Hezekiah, he took out some of the riches and gave them to Assyria, paying them off, and beginning the period of time when they would be paying tribute to the Assyrians. And so Tilgath-Pileser left, and Sennacherib came back later and conquered, again going down the coastal line down into the border with Egypt. So in the bottom middle we have a stone, and this stone is out of Assyria. It's ancient artifact, and this tells the story from the Assyrian point of view of everything we're reading here. And so we know that this story is accurate, not just because the Bible tells it, but we know that the story is accurate because the Assyrians tell it. Howbeit, they do tell it from a different perspective because they were the ones writing it. But the same overview is still here. The Assyrians come down, they take out the 10 tribes in the northern part, and they subjugate the southern tribes. But we know that the actual destruction of the southern tribes doesn't come yet, and this is important. So it's just interesting to think through these things. Again, as they come up on Jerusalem, Hezekiah searches out the prophets, goes to God, begs God for help, where the 10 northern tribes did not go to God. Ahab and Jezebel were not going to be going to God and asking him for help. They were all out trying to destroy God's people. So this is the story that we have in the beginning of Micah's prophecy coming into this. It's important to think about this in terms of today, because oftentimes the things that we are proud about in ourselves, maybe our wisdom, maybe our strength, maybe who knows what it might be, can actually become our downfall. And so this is why God calls us always to be humble and meek, calls us to live simply, and rather than pursuing all the great things of this world, just choose to be good people. Just choose to be good people, be honest, be faithful, follow God's commandments, and all will turn out well. If Israel had done this, all would have turned out well. But they did not do this. They rebelled against God. And when we rebel against God, it doesn't necessarily mean that we reject Him wholeheartedly. What it means is we continue to be religious, but we set aside God and God's commandments. We set aside God's ministry. We set aside God's prophets. We don't want to hear them because what they're telling us isn't beautiful. It isn't what we want to hear. And so we begin setting up our own ministry. We begin setting up our own prophets, our own idols, our own altars, our own religious institutions that actually tell us what we want to hear. And this was the problem that was happening in that time. Again, it's what happens today. So often we end up seeing so many of the religious institutions that exist in the world exist not because they want to follow God's commandments, but on the contrary, they want to follow their own. And so we should take this wisdom that Micah is giving us to heart and, again, apply it first and foremost in our own lives. So I hope this will help you in your own studies. We'll be going slowly through the book of Micah, and I'll be putting the videos up. Till next time, God bless.